In the autumn of 1415, Henry V stood deep in enemy territory. His army, weakened by dysentery and days of marching, was running out of strength. The French outnumbered the English by more than 3 to 1. Nobles, knights, and banners stretched for miles across the fields. The English camped in a narrow, muddy field between two forests, their backs to the trees, their path forward blocked by fate. Henry gave no grand speech. He simply walked among his men, calm and quiet. Dawn broke on October 25th. Mist clung to the earth, and the ground was soaked with rain. The French knights prepared for a glorious charge. They laughed, drank wine, and polished their armor beneath fluttering banners. The English longbowmen waited silently behind sharpened stakes. Their bows were ready, eyes fixed on the horizon. Trumpets sounded from the French side, and the knights began to move. Armor clashed and hooves thundered across the field. But the wet earth betrayed them. The field had turned to thick mud, and horses sank with every step. English arrows filled the sky like a storm. The sound of steel piercing flesh echoed across the field. The French cavalry became disorganized in the mud. Riders crashed into each other, falling beneath their own weight. English arrows struck with deadly precision. Armored knights collapsed before ever reaching the enemy line. The narrow battlefield left no room to maneuver. French reinforcements arrived only to be trapped behind their own men. Henry's archers dropped their bows and ran forward with axes and mallets. They joined the fight hand to hand, brutal and desperate. Among the fallen, noble banners lay trampled in the mud. What began as glory had turned into slaughter. The cries of the wounded echoed through the smoke and fog. Men struggled to rise only to be struck down again. Henry stood at the center, his sword drawn, leading not as a king, but as a soldier. Mud clung to his armor, blood to his blade. The French nobility, once proud and shining, lay broken in the filth. Some surrendered, others died on their knees. As the sun climbed higher, the battle neared its end. The English held the field, stunned by what they had survived. What began as hopelessness had turned into one of the greatest upsets in military history. The fields of Agincourt were soaked in blood, but they belonged to England. The French leadership was in ruins. Many of their greatest lords had perished in the mud. Henry V gave the order to execute captured French nobles. It was a brutal decision, driven by fear of renewed attack. The English were too exhausted to cheer. They stood in silence, surrounded by carnage. That evening, rain began to fall once more. It washed the blood into the soil of northern France. From that battlefield, Henry would march to Calais. But the memory of Agincourt would never leave his men. French mothers would wait for sons who never returned. Their names whispered in prayers, their faces fading with time. Chroniclers would write of courage, but also of mud, rain, and death. Agincourt was not a chivalrous duel. It was a slaughter. In England, bells rang in celebration, but behind the victory lay grief too deep for words. Henry became a legend, but he never forgot the cost. He wore the weight of Agincourt for the rest of his life. Centuries later, the battle would echo in poems and plays, a moment when the underdog triumphed against all odds. Agincourt changed the course of the 100 Years' War. France was shaken, and England stood taller than ever before. But no land was truly won that day, only graves were gained. The soil of northern France drank deeply from both sides. The myth of knightly warfare shattered. From now on, longbows and mud would rule the battlefield. Henry's march to Calais was slow and silent. The road was lined not with victory, but with ghosts. And yet, the legend grew, of a king, a muddy field, and 1,000 arrows. Agincourt became a name spoken in awe and in sorrow. Chroniclers struggled to capture the scale of the horror. Their quills scratched parchment, but the screams could not be written. Agincourt showed that numbers alone could not guarantee victory. Discipline, terrain, and timing rewrote the rules of war. The French army, proud and mighty, had drowned in its own ambition. Their cavalry, once unstoppable, was humbled by rain and wood. Back in London, Henry was greeted as a hero, but in his eyes, the battle had not ended. Each man who survived carried Agincourt in his heart, and each grave left behind carried a name never spoken again. Centuries later, the echoes of Agincourt still stir the soul. It became legend, not for glory, but for resilience. Bards sang of arrows that darkened the sky, of a king who stood not behind his men, but beside them. The mud, the rain, the courage, all burned into history. It was not just a battle, it was a reckoning. In quiet corners of France, the fields remain. Peaceful now, but never forgetful. Agincourt is more than a place, it is a memory. One that whispers through time to those who choose to listen.